Lost in a war-torn town, a woman rescues freezing puppies from the storm. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the abandoned streets of the war-torn town. The wind howled between the shattered buildings, rattling broken window panes and shaking loose bits of debris. Somewhere in the distance, a metal sign creaked, its rusted hinges groaning under the weight of the storm. Lena Carter sat on the edge of a worn-out cot, staring at the flickering candle beside her. The tiny flame danced in the cold air, casting long shadows on the cracked walls. Her fingers traced the edges of an old photograph resting on her lap. It was bent and faded, the colors washed away by time, but she could still make out the faces, her colleagues, her team, the people she had worked with in places that no longer existed. Her heart clenched. She had spent 15 years as a war journalist, chasing stories in the world's darkest corners. She had seen villages burned to the ground, parents sobbing over lifeless children, entire cities reduced to nothing but dust and rubble. And she had written about it all, believing that words could make a difference. But now she wasn't so sure. 6 months ago, in the middle of a bombing in Ukraine, she had watched a young mother clutch her baby and beg for help. Lena had tried to pull them both to safety, but the explosion hit before she could reach them. The blast knocked her off her feet. The heat, the fire, the screams, it was all a blur. When she woke up in a field hospital 2 days later, she found out that the mother and child hadn't survived. Something inside her had broken that day. She had walked away from journalism, from everything she had ever known. Now she was here, in a nameless village on the edge of Eastern Europe, a place no one cared about, a place forgotten by the world. It was supposed to be temporary, a quiet escape, a place to heal. But weeks had passed, and the silence was suffocating. The house she had taken shelter in was barely more than ruins. The walls were crumbling, the roof leaked when it rained, and the cold seeped through every crack. She could have left, could have gone back to the US, found a warm apartment, and tried to move on. But she didn't, because deep down she didn't believe she deserved warmth. She rubbed her hands together, trying to chase away the numbness in her fingers. The radio on the rickety table crackled to life for a moment, breaking the silence. But all it delivered was static. She turned it off. Outside, the snowstorm thickened. The world was white, empty, just like her life. She leaned back against the wall, exhaling slowly. Maybe this was it. Maybe she would spend the rest of her days in this broken town, haunted by memories and regret. And then a sound. Soft at first, almost drowned by the wind. A cry. Faint, desperate. Lena's heart skipped a beat. She sat up listening. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, but then it came again, a high-pitched whimper carried by the storm. A child? No, not a child, but something just as helpless. She grabbed her coat and flashlight, barely pausing to pull on her boots before stepping out into the freezing night. The wind hit her like a blade, cutting through her clothes, stealing the air from her lungs. The cries grew louder. Something was out there, something small, something alone. Lena forced her legs to move, trudging through the deep snow. She didn't know what she would find, but she knew one thing: she had to find it. The wind roared like an angry beast, whipping snow across Lena's face as she pushed forward. Her boots sank deep into the frozen ground, each step a battle against the storm. The cries grew louder, weak, desperate, but still fighting. She swung her flashlight in wide arcs, the beam barely cutting through the swirling snow. The sound was close now, just beyond a pile of rubble where a building had collapsed months ago. She stumbled forward, her breath coming in short, frosty gasps. Then she saw them. 6 tiny figures, half buried in the snow, huddled together in a small pocket of space beneath a fallen wooden beam. Their fur was soaked, clumped together with ice. Their tiny bodies trembled violently, their cries fading to soft whimpers. Puppies. Lena's chest tightened. They were so small, so fragile. Their eyes weren't even fully open yet. She dropped to her knees, ignoring the biting cold seeping through her jeans. Carefully, she reached out and touched the nearest one, a little thing with a patch of black over one eye. It flinched, but was too weak to resist. "No, no, no," she whispered, fear gripping her throat. "You can't die. Not now." Her fingers brushed over the others, counting. 6, barely clinging to life. Their mother was nowhere in sight. Had she abandoned them? Or worse, had she not survived? Lena's mind flashed back to another scene. A little boy in Syria, buried under rubble, his tiny fingers reaching for his mother, who would never wake up again. She shook her head, pushing the memory aside. These puppies were here, now, and they needed her. She yanked off her scarf and wrapped them in it, scooping them into her arms. They were light as feathers, their bodies radiating no warmth at all. Panic surged inside her. They're too cold. They won't make it. Lena stood, tightening her grip around them as she turned back toward her house. The storm raged harder, but she didn't feel it anymore. All that mattered was getting them inside. Her boots slipped on the ice as she ran, her breath coming in harsh gasps. The wind tore at her clothes, the snow blinded her, but she held the puppies close, shielding them with her body. By the time she stumbled back into the house, her fingers were numb, her lungs burning. She kicked the door shut behind her and fell to her knees, unwrapping the bundle of fur. They barely moved. "Come on, stay with me," she begged, her hands shaking as she reached for a blanket. She rushed to the fireplace, throwing more wood into the weak flames. The fire crackled, struggling against the cold. She grabbed a towel, wrapping the puppies one by one, rubbing their tiny bodies to bring back warmth. They barely reacted. "No, don't do this," she whispered. Her heart pounded. She had covered war zones, escaped gunfire, and survived bombings. But now she was terrified of losing 6 tiny lives. She ran to the kitchen, searching. Milk! They need milk! Nothing. Her stomach twisted. She had no formula, no supplies for newborn animals. What was she supposed to do? She grabbed her coat again, ready to run back out, ready to do anything. Then, the smallest puppy let out a soft, weak whimper. Lena froze. It was alive. Barely, but alive. And as long as they were breathing, she wasn't giving up. She scooped them up again and held them close, whispering, "I promise I won't let you die." She would find a way. She had to.
The wind howled outside, shaking the fragile walls of the ruined house. But inside, near the flickering glow of the fire, there was warmth. Lena sat cross-legged on the floor, wrapped in a tattered blanket, the 6 tiny puppies bundled together inside an old sweater beside her. They were still weak, but at least now their shivering had slowed. She watched them carefully, her brows drawn in worry. The smallest one, a fragile little thing with a white patch on its forehead, barely moved. "Come on, buddy," she whispered, gently rubbing its back with her fingers. "Stay with me." It let out a tiny whimper, and something inside Lena cracked. She had spent years reporting on war, capturing stories of survivors and casualties. She had seen children lose their families, fathers crumble under grief, and mothers scream into the ruins of their homes. She had written about it all. But this was different. This wasn't a story for the world. This wasn't about headlines or breaking news. This was just her and them. 6 tiny creatures, abandoned in the snow, depending on her for survival. And for the first time in a long time, she felt needed. She reached for the cup of warm water she had placed near the fire and dipped the edge of a rag into it, then slowly pressed it to the smallest puppy's mouth. "Just a little, okay?" she murmured. At first, there was nothing. Then a slow, hesitant lick. Lena exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That's it! Good boy." One by one, she did the same for the others, making sure each of them took in a little warmth, even if it wasn't much. Their tiny bellies barely rose and fell as they huddled together in sleep. She sat back against the wall, her body aching with exhaustion. What now? She had no food for them, no real supplies. And the storm outside was growing worse by the hour. She closed her eyes, pressing her fingers to her temple. She could call someone, a rescue shelter, a vet, anyone. But there was no one left here. This town had been deserted for months, its people scattered by war. The only other human presence was miles away, a small refugee camp on the other side of the valley. Could she make it there? Her gut twisted. The roads were buried under snow, and even if she managed to walk that far, there was no guarantee they'd have anything for orphaned puppies. The refugees barely had enough for themselves. She was on her own. Lena sighed, running a hand through her hair. She glanced down at the puppies, curled up so closely they almost looked like one creature instead of 6. A strange warmth settled in her chest. They had been left behind, just like this town. forgotten by the world, just like she had been. But they were still fighting, still alive. And if they could fight, then so could she. She pulled the blanket tighter around them and whispered, "I don't know how, but we're going to figure this out. Together." Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, for the first time in a long time, Lena didn't feel so alone. Lena woke to the sound of soft whimpers. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure if it was a dream or reality. The fire had burned low, casting flickering orange shadows across the walls. The cold had crept in again, its icy fingers stretching through the gaps in the walls, seeping into her bones. Then she heard it again, a tiny, pitiful cry. She pushed herself upright, her body aching from sleeping on the floor. The puppies were huddled in the sweater she had wrapped around them, but one was stirring, its frail body trembling more than the others, the smallest one. Lena reached out, gently scooping it into her hands. Its fur was softer now, no longer stiff with ice, but its breathing was shallow. Panic flared in her chest. "No, don't do this," she whispered, pulling the puppy closer to her chest, trying to share her warmth. She rocked back and forth, instinctively comforting it, the way she had once seen a mother soothe her child in a refugee camp. A mother who had lost everything. A mother who hadn't survived. Her throat tightened. She had watched so many people die, written their stories, told the world about their suffering. But no matter how many words she had spilled onto a page, it had never been enough to save them. She thought she had buried those feelings, that helplessness, that guilt. But now it was clawing its way back, sitting heavy on her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. Tears burned at the edges of her eyes, but she swallowed them down. Not this time. She wasn't going to let this one slip away. With shaking hands, she grabbed a small piece of cloth, dipped it into the warm water by the fire, and pressed it gently to the puppy's mouth. "Come on, little guy," she murmured, her voice breaking. "You have to try." At first, there was nothing. The tiny body in her hands remained still, barely breathing. Then, a flicker of movement, a slow, weak lick. Lena let out a sharp breath, relief hitting her so hard she nearly laughed. She kept going, feeding the puppy drop by drop until its breathing deepened, its body warming against her hands. For the first time in months, she felt something break inside her, not in a painful way. In a way that felt like the first breath of spring after a long, brutal winter. She looked at the tiny creature curled against her palm, so fragile, so innocent, and something clicked. She had spent her life telling stories of war, stories of death and destruction, stories that showed the worst of humanity. But this was a story about fighting to survive, about holding on, about choosing life, even when everything seemed lost. Lena took a deep, shaky breath and whispered, "You're going to make it, and so am I." The weight in her chest didn't disappear entirely, but for the first time in a long time it felt lighter. The storm had finally begun to settle, but the world outside was still blanketed in thick, untouched snow. The wind had left behind an eerie silence, as if the entire village had been swallowed by winter. Inside the ruined house, the puppies lay curled together in a warm nest of blankets near the fire. They were stronger now, breathing steadily, their tiny bodies rising and falling in rhythm. The smallest one, whom Lena had started calling Ghost because of his pale fur, was no longer deathly still. Lena sat beside them, a cup of steaming water cupped between her hands. There was no tea, no sugar, just warmth. That was enough. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel completely alone. But then, a noise. It was faint, almost drowned out by the crackling fire. Lena's head snapped up. A soft crunch of snow just outside her door. Her muscles tensed. No one lived in this town anymore. The last of the villagers had fled months ago, driven away by war, hunger, and fear. Her heart pounded. Was it an animal? A wolf? Or was it someone dangerous? She set the cup down and reached for the rusted iron rod she had found in the wreckage weeks ago, her only form of defense. Slowly, she rose to her feet and moved toward the door, careful not to make a sound. Then a knock, soft, hesitant. Lena froze. For a long moment, she didn't move, barely even breathed. Then the knock came again. Lighter this time, almost weak. Lena tightened her grip on the rod. Taking a steadying breath, she reached for the door handle and yanked it open. A boy stood there, no older than 9 or 10. He was thin, too thin, his clothes tattered and soaked from the snow. A dirty scarf was wrapped around his face, leaving only a pair of wide, terrified eyes visible. Lena's stomach twisted. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days. For a second, neither of them spoke. The boy just stood there, his small hands clenched into fists, his shoulders shaking from cold or maybe fear. Lena lowered the iron rod. "Hey," she said, keeping her voice gentle. "Are you lost?" The boy didn't answer. He just stared at her, as if deciding whether to trust her or run. Lena's mind raced. Where had he come from? The nearest refugee camp was miles away. Had he been left behind? Had he been hiding all this time? She took a slow step back, giving him space. "I won't hurt you," she said softly. "Do you want to come inside? It's warm." The boy hesitated. His eyes flicked past her, landing on the puppies near the fire. His lips parted slightly, and for the first time something flickered in his gaze. Not fear. Recognition. Then, in a voice so small it barely reached her ears, he whispered, "You found them." Lena's breath caught. "Them?" Her eyes darted to the puppies, then back to the boy. Realization crashed over her like a tidal wave. These weren't just any puppies. They were his. Lena stared at the boy, her heart pounding. "You found them." His words echoed in her head, slicing through the thick silence between them. The wind howled behind him, whipping snow against the broken doorframe, but he didn't move. He just stood there, his small, thin body trembling, his wide, dark eyes locked onto the 6 puppies nestled by the fire. Lena swallowed hard. You know them?" she asked carefully. The boy nodded, his lips pressing together as if afraid to speak. Lena stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come inside," she urged. "It's freezing out there." For a moment, he hesitated. Then, without a word, he stepped forward. As soon as the warmth of the fire hit him, he let out a small, shaky breath. His fingers, stiff with cold, unfurled slightly. But his eyes never left the puppies. Lena shut the door against the storm, then moved cautiously toward him. "What's your name?" she asked. The boy hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Luca." Lena nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Luca, are these your puppies?" A flicker of emotion crossed his face. Pain, relief, something deeper. He swallowed and nodded again. "They were." His voice cracked. He clenched his fists. "They were my mother's." Lena felt her stomach drop. She knew what that meant before he even said the next words. "She told me to stay hidden," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "She went to find food. She never came back." Lena's throat tightened. She had seen this story play out too many times in war zones. A mother doing everything she could to protect her child, until she couldn't. Luca's hands shook as he slowly crouched beside the puppies. One of them, a scrappy little brown one, lifted its head and let out a weak but happy whimper. Luca exhaled sharply, his fingers gently brushing over the soft fur. Tears welled in his eyes. "She saved them," he whispered. "She found them in the snow and carried them in her coat. But then..." His voice faded. He squeezed his eyes shut. "She didn't come back." Lena pressed a hand against her chest, forcing herself to breathe through the tightness. For the past few weeks, she had felt lost, drowning in her own ghosts. But standing in front of her was a child who had lost everything, and yet he had survived. And now he had found the only family he had left. She knelt beside him, keeping her movements slow, cautious. "Luca, how long were you alone?" He didn't answer right away. He just stared at the puppies, his small fingers curling into their fur. Finally, in a barely there voice, he whispered, 32 days. Lena's breath hitched. A month. A child no older than 10, surviving alone in an abandoned town. In the middle of winter. She had seen soldiers break in less time. Lucas sniffed, quickly wiping his face with the sleeve of his tattered jacket. His fingers, still raw from the cold, trembled as he stroked one of the puppies. "I tried to keep them warm," he said. "I tried to feed them, but I ran out of food. I thought they died." His voice broke on the last word. Lena didn't think. She just reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "They're alive," she whispered. "You kept them alive." Lucas' face crumpled, but he didn't cry. He just nodded, his whole body shaking. Lena took a steadying breath. A month alone in the ruins of a war-torn town. No food, no help. And now, after all that, a blizzard was coming. Her heart clenched. She had barely been able to keep herself and the puppies alive. Now she had a starving child to protect too. And there was no way to escape before the storm hit. She glanced toward the window. Outside, the wind had picked up again, whipping snow across the broken streets. The temperature was dropping fast. They were running out of time. She turned back to Luca. "When's the last time you ate?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Yesterday, maybe the day before." Lena swallowed hard. She had one can of soup left. That was it. Her stomach twisted, but she didn't hesitate. She grabbed the can and quickly lit the small gas burner she had scavenged from an abandoned store. As soon as the soup started to warm, the smell filled the tiny space, and Luca sat up a little straighter. He didn't beg, didn't ask. He just waited, like he was used to being hungry. Lena bit the inside of her cheek, forcing herself to stay steady. She poured the soup into a dented tin cup and handed it to him. "Eat," she said softly. Luca took the cup, his small hands wrapped tightly around it, as if afraid it would disappear. He took one sip, then another. Then he closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Lena felt her throat tighten. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving for herself. She had someone else to protect now, and she was going to make sure they both lived through this storm. The blizzard hit harder than Lena expected. By morning, the world outside had disappeared beneath thick walls of snow. The door groaned under the weight of it, icy wind howling through the cracks in the walls. Inside, the fire burned low, casting a dim, flickering glow across the tiny space. Luca sat beside the puppies, his knees drawn to his chest, watching them sleep. He had barely spoken since last night, but something in his posture had changed. He wasn't just waiting anymore. He was watching over them. Lena set down the empty soup can she had scraped clean the night before and exhaled. They had food for one more day. Maybe two, if she skipped her share. That wasn't going to be enough. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and walked to the window, wiping away the frost with her sleeve. The glass was cracked, but she could see just enough. Snow piled waist-high, the streets barely recognizable. They were trapped. Her fingers curled into fists. Luca needed real food. The puppies needed warm milk or formula, not just the tiny scraps she had been managing to feed them. She had to do something. Luca's voice was soft when he spoke. "Are we going to die here?" Lena turned. The way he said it, flat, almost emotionless, made her stomach twist. This wasn't a child who was afraid of dying. This was a child who had already accepted it as a possibility. "No," she said firmly. She crossed the room and crouched in front of him. "I won't let that happen, I promise." Luca looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Finally, he nodded. Lena took a slow breath. "There's a refugee camp outside the valley. If we can get there, they might have supplies, food, medicine, even a vet for the puppies." Luca frowned. "But the storm." "I know." She glanced at the window again. "We can't leave today, but as soon as it clears, we go." Luca hesitated. Then softly he asked, "What if it doesn't clear?" Lena didn't have an answer for that, so she did the only thing she could. She stood up, grabbed a battered notebook from the table and tossed it toward him. "Here," she said. Luca caught it, frowning. "What's this?" "A distraction." He flipped it open. The pages were mostly blank, except for the first few, which were filled with notes and sketches from when Lena had first arrived. She had written things about the town, what was left of it, the people who had been here before the war, the way the landscape had changed. Luca ran his fingers over the rough paper. "You used to be a writer?" he asked. Lena swallowed. "Something like that." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, Luca grabbed a pencil and with slow, careful strokes started drawing. Lena leaned over his shoulder, surprised. It was a puppy. Not perfectly drawn, but full of life. Tiny curled paws, sleepy eyes, fur marked with uneven shading. A lump formed in Lena's throat. She had spent so long documenting war, pain, and loss. Luca had spent so long living it. But here, in the middle of a storm, in a town no one remembered, he was still creating something, still holding on to hope. Lena reached over and gently ruffled his hair. "That's good," she murmured. "Really good." Luca didn't say anything, but his shoulders relaxed just a little. Maybe they were trapped. Maybe the storm wouldn't let up for days. But in this moment, with 6 puppies huddled between them, with a notebook full of blank pages waiting to be filled, they weren't just surviving. They were moving forward. The blizzard finally broke on the 4th day. Lena had barely slept. She had spent the past few nights feeding the puppies in shifts, making sure they stayed warm, watching over Luca as he curled up near the fire. Now, as the morning sun bled through the cracked window, she felt a cautious sense of relief. The storm had left behind a world of untouched white, burying the ruined town beneath layers of soft, glistening snow. But more importantly, they could leave. Luca sat near the puppies, flipping through the notebook where he had sketched each of them. He didn't say much, but Lena noticed the way he hesitated when she started packing the little supplies they had left. "We should get going soon," she said. "The refugee camp isn't far, but the snow will slow us down." Luca's fingers tensed around the pencil in his hand. After a long pause, he finally whispered, "What if they take the puppies away?" Lena exhaled slowly. She had been thinking about that too. The refugee camp would have food, shelter, and medical supplies, but it wasn't a home for 6 stray puppies. She sat down beside him, letting the fire warm her face. "They need more than what we can give them," she said gently. "Food, a safe place, people who can care for them." Luca didn't answer. He just traced the outline of one of the puppies in his notebook, his movements slow and deliberate. Lena hesitated, then reached out and turned the page. The next sketch wasn't of the puppies. It was of her. She stilled. It was rough, unfinished. Her hair was a mess of scribbled lines, her coat too big, the shadows under her eyes drawn heavier than she would have liked. But it was her. Luca had drawn her the way he saw her. Not as a journalist, not as a woman who had run away from her past, but as someone who had saved him. A lump formed in her throat. She swallowed it down and gently ruffled his hair. "You're going to be okay, Luca." He stared at the page for a long time, then finally nodded. Lena exhaled, relief and sadness tangling inside her chest. She wasn't sure when it had happened, when they had become a family. But somehow, in the middle of all this loss, they had found something worth holding on to. Even if it meant having to let go. The journey to the refugee camp. The snow was deep, slowing their pace, but Lena and Luca pushed forward, carrying the puppies bundled inside Lena's coat. Luca was quiet, but he held his head higher than before. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was walking towards something new. When they finally reached the camp, Lena's heart clenched at the sight. Rows of tents stretched across the valley, smoke curling from small fires, people wrapped in layers of donated clothes. Children played in the snow, their laughter ringing through the cold air. The moment they stepped inside the gates, a woman in a thick coat rushed toward them. "You made it," she breathed. "We were worried." Lena recognized her. One of the aid workers she had spoken to once before. Anna's gaze dropped to the puppies nestled against Lena's chest. "Are they?" "Alive," Lena said, "but they need care, food, a vet if you have one." Anna's expression softened. "We'll take care of them." Lena nodded, but her chest ached. She had known this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. One by one, she unwrapped the puppies and handed them over. The smallest one, Ghost, let out a weak whimper as Anna cradled him against her scarf. Luca clenched his fists but didn't say anything. When the last puppy was taken, he exhaled slowly, his breath misting in the cold air. Lena placed a hand on his shoulder. "We did the right thing." Luca swallowed hard. Then for the first time, he reached up and held onto her hand. That night, for the first time in months, Lena slept without nightmares. And when she woke the next morning, Luca was still there, sitting by the fire, flipping through his notebook. He looked up at her and smiled, a small, tired, but real smile. Lena smiled back, because for the first time in a long time, she knew they weren't just surviving anymore. They were moving forward. Together. Spring came slowly, as if unsure whether it was welcome. The snowdrifts began to shrink, the frozen earth softening under the warmth of the sun. Trees that had stood lifeless for months stretched their branches toward the sky, buds of green pushing through. Birds returned, their songs filling the once silent valley. Lena sat outside the refugee camp, watching the world change. She had been here for 2 months now. At first, she had planned to leave. She had told herself that once Luca was safe, once the puppies were taken care of, she would move on. But something had shifted. Maybe it was the way Luca had started to laugh again, or the way people here needed help, not just survival. Maybe it was the way she had started writing again, filling pages with stories of hope instead of war. Or maybe it was the simple fact that, for the first time in years, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Lena sighed, closing her notebook and stretching her legs. She had spent the morning working at the medical tent, helping organize supplies. Luca had been in the children's area, sketching with some of the younger kids. She glanced toward the camp entrance, just as a familiar voice called her name. Lena! She turned and saw Anna, the aid worker who had taken in the puppies. Lena's heart skipped a beat. What is it? Anna grinned. You should come see for yourself. The small animal shelter sat at the edge of the camp, built from salvaged wood and old tents. Inside, the moment Lena stepped through the door, 6 pairs of familiar eyes turned toward her. The puppies. They had grown. Their fur was clean and fluffy, their bodies stronger. They tumbled over each other in excitement, yipping and wagging their tails as they recognized her. Lena knelt down, laughing as a familiar white-furred pup, Ghost, scrambled into her lap, licking her chin. They've been waiting for you, Anna said. Lena swallowed against the lump in her throat. They're okay. More than okay, Anna said, and we found homes for most of them. Lena's chest tightened. She had known this was coming, but letting go still wasn't easy. She glanced at Luca, who stood quietly beside her, his fingers curled around the notebook he always carried. What do you think? She asked him softly. Luca looked at the puppies, then at her. Finally, he smiled. I think it's good. Lena exhaled, feeling the weight of months lift from her shoulders. Yes! It was good. Over the next week, one by one, the puppies left with their new families. Scout, the fearless explorer, went with an aid worker who spent his days hiking into remote villages. Buttercup, the energetic one, was adopted by a woman with 3 children who instantly adored her. Patches found a home with an elderly couple who had lost their dog during the war. Molly, Shadow, Rusty, all of them found places where they belonged. All except one. Ghost. Lena knelt beside him on their last night together, scratching behind his ears. You're the last one left, she murmured. Ghost looked up at her with sleepy, trusting eyes, his tiny tail wagging. Luca sat nearby, flipping through his sketches. You could keep him, he said after a moment. Lena hesitated. I don't know. Luca smirked. You kept me. Lena let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. That's different. Not really. Luca shrugged. We both needed a home. Lena opened her mouth to argue, but then she looked at Ghost, at his soft fur, his small, warm body curled against her. And she knew. She had spent so long running from the past, from loss, from everything. But here, in this small refugee camp, surrounded by the echoes of what had been lost, she had found something real. Something worth staying for. She glanced at Luca and smiled. All right, she said. He stays. Luca grinned. Took you long enough. Weeks passed, then months. Lena never left. She worked at the camp, writing stories about rebuilding, not just survival. She sent out articles, helping raise donations for the refugees. She taught Luca how to write alongside his sketches, helping him tell his own story. And Ghost? Ghost became family. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Lena sat outside the camp, watching Luca play in the grass with the dog. She took out her notebook and started writing. Not about war, not about loss, but about new beginnings. And as she wrote, she realized something. She wasn't lost anymore. She was finally home. The end.